sound. So that's started. I'll start the clock here in a second, do my little intro thing, and let me start the view with speaker view, and then I'll go to gallery view so that we are able to be there together. All right, so
Sure.
3, 2, 1, and start. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Reference Point. I'm your host, Dave Cokerhook, and I'm really glad you're here today because we're going to have a very interesting conversation with a gentleman from a company called Emrod that's headquartered in New Zealand. And his name is Greg Kushnir, and Greg is the founder and CEO of this company, Emrod. And what we're going to talk about is the wireless transmission of electrical energy. Now, this is something that's been a dream for people for a very long time, and any of you who may have had any opportunity to read any of the works of someone like Nikola Tesla, you know that this was something that he had been thinking about decades and decades ago. And the folks at Emrod have finally been able to make that happen. So I'm thrilled to have them here. So Greg, welcome to Reference Point, and thank you so much for setting aside some time to be here with us today.
Oh, thank you very much, Dave, for having me on, and thank you for your patience. I know it took a while to arrange this.
No problem.
So
let's talk about this area of wireless transmission of electrical energy. This is not a new concept, right? I mean, what's taken so long to try to get something functional in place for this type of technology?
it's a very good question, which I'm often asked. So you're right, it's not a new concept. Nikola Tesla, as you mentioned, in fact, published it quite widely. I mean, he talked about the benefits to humanity if we can access electricity everywhere. And I think, actually, I believe it was 100 years. We celebrated 100 years for that to that article about 2 weeks ago. So the concept, as you noted, has been floating around for quite a while, and the benefits of going wireless with energy have been talked about for quite a while. In the 60s of the 20th century, 60s, 70s, there was quite a bit of research off the back of the Second World War, research into radar.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that, one of the side projects that were going on is, can we transmit energy wirelessly? And back then it has been demonstrated by NASA and Raytheon that indeed this is not just doable, it's, I dare say, almost practical. They demonstrated keeping a helicopter drone in the air, and that was quite a while ago.
Mm-hmm.
And ever since, it has remained an active research program with a few institutes, namely, well, mainly with NASA, but also with the likes of JAXA, the Japanese Space Agency, and recently in China and South Korea. So it has been around for a while, but the focus of those research programs were, and still are, mostly space applications rather than commercial. So the thing that has changed is twofold. One is conceptually. So we thought that this type of technology, this type of enabling technology, is very similar to previously commercialized technologies like solar panels or the internet. It would benefit humanity tremendously if we took that, not away, but took that level of research from governments and started applying it commercially. There's a lot to gain. So the first change was conceptual. The second change is, look, we can't avoid facing up to the fact that Nikola Tesla is you know, he was an amazing visionary, but let's face it, he didn't even know about the structure of the atom like we know today. So there's quite a bit of knowledge that has to be accumulated. Same goes for the 60s and 70s of the previous century. While they had the right set of technologies, the materials, the computation was just not there, not quite there yet. What changed in recent years is the availability of high computing power. So we're able to model things much more accurately and much faster. And then there's 3D printing technology. So we're able not just to model it, but also to build smaller scales, one-offs, prototyping relatively quickly, relatively cheaply. So those set of technologies lend themselves to commercial endeavors like Emrod, rather than high-budgeted organizations like space agencies.
Right.
So it's really computing power, the availability of computing power and material technology. Quite a lot of interesting new materials.
So what you're saying is that the time is right for this now. We have advanced in certain ways in terms of technological advancement from computer perspective, but also we have some of these new materials, right, that we have available to us now that may not have been available, 30 years ago and things like that. So this is the right time to be able to do something like this, right? And one of the things when I first found out about what you guys do that really struck me was I thought about what goes on here in the US in certain times of the year. Okay, I live in California. A couple of years ago, and actually almost every summer, we have these massive wildfires in communities and the electricity goes down. I lived in New England for a while. They have snowstorms and they got all the wires hanging and the wires get ice on them and they break. And then, all windstorm, all this sort of stuff happens. And it's like, I guess the first thing that people thought of was, why don't they bury these things? Put the wires underground so that they don't, they don't break in the snowstorms and the ice storms. But this that you're doing, it takes it to another level. Can you give us some description as to exactly how this works?
Sure. And I think you're absolutely correct that the timing is right. The stars are aligned, and not just because the technology is mature enough to be commercialized, it's also because the need and the awareness is there. Wildfires, frequent outages, the move to decentralize grids, the uptake of sustainable energy, all these things can be done quicker, cheaper, faster, better with wireless. Removing wires means that you remove quite a bit of vulnerability from networks. So anyone looking at network resilience is definitely interested in going wireless. We've got utilities everywhere from Norway to Pacific Islands. Everyone saying pretty much the same thing. The thrust to decarbonize, for example, is a big driver as well. Decarbonizing ports, decarbonizing mines. Quite a lot of it is for isolated sort of communities or mines and so on, they rely on burning diesel. Not very eco-friendly. So going wireless is a solution for them. So I think it's twofold. The stars are aligned both because the need and the awareness is there, and because the technology is there. So you asked me about the technology and how it works. So lucky for me, it's relatively easy to explain.
Oh, good.
Aren't many, it's not magic. There aren't many moving parts. So essentially you have the transmitting side, which resembles radar technology to a large degree. So we're using patch antennas, many small elements that take in electricity and then turn it into microwaves. Essentially the same stuff that goes out from cellular phones. So the frequency is either 2.4 or 5.8 gigahertz, sometimes around 10 gigahertz. It's exactly the same stuff that Bluetooth and Wi-Fi are made of. The main difference is that we are creating a collimated beam, so a highly directional, narrow beam that travels in parallel, unlike communication, which blasts pretty much everywhere.
Right.
So that's on the transmit side, taking in electricity, turning it into a highly collimated, well-controlled beam.
Okay.
On the receive side, it's I guess the main technology is somewhat similar to stealth technology. So we're using materials or metamaterials that absorb electromagnetic waves and turn them into something rather than reflecting them back. That, in our case, that something is back into electricity. And that's quite an efficient process, especially in recent years. The efficiency on that side have gone to 90% plus, so, and it's still progressing.
Wow,
so
that's great.
there you have it, electricity into electromagnetic beaming. and then electromagnetic beaming back into electricity. Obviously, it's a bit more complex than that. We sometimes
sure, but for a layman, for a layperson like myself, that makes sense. Is this what happens if something gets in the way of the beam? A tree, a flying bird. You know what I mean? Is there any challenge in the transmission, either to the ability of the beam to actually reach its destination, or for whatever happens to cross its path?
Good question, Dave, because no technology is worth commercializing if it's not safe, right? You have to first make sure that it's safe and then that it's economically viable. So in this case, we are fortunate to have a good body of knowledge that has been accumulated over the last probably 50 years or so, even more, about what you can, what you should and shouldn't do with electromagnetic radiation, and specifically in the frequencies that are used by communication. So we are operating in the ISM band, the Industrial Scientific Medical band, which means that we can enjoy that body of information and act accordingly. It's also quite useful that our systems are strictly point-to-point. So they're not designed to expose anyone to anything. Now, in the case of a transient object going through the main beam, say a bird or a helicopter or a naughty glider, so there are a few layers of safety. One is inherent in the system, which is a laser curtain. So around the main beam, where all the energy is concentrated, there is a laser safety curtain. So anything that breaks into that laser curtain triggers either a dousing of the beam or shutting down of certain elements in the beam.
Oh, okay. All right.
So for example, if we have a relatively large antenna and has many elements, we can actually track a bird while it's moving through the path of the beam and shut down the correlating elements, which is quite useful because then you don't really feel any interruptions in the electricity supply.
Very cool.
So that's, yeah, it is. It's not quite really like cool. Not quite like tracking a missile. You know, birds are relatively slow. So that's one system. The fact that it's point to point with no radiation going anywhere, so there's no impact, above or below or to the sides of the main beam. Okay. And it has to have line of sight between the antennas. So that means that it's mounted in places where you don't expect anything to cross. So that's, again, another safety layer. And the third, I guess, is just is quite inherent. The thing that is happening in the atmosphere when we transmit that beam is essentially just like what's happening when a cell phone is transmitting. Only that in our case, it's much better guided, much better controlled. So we can't blast holes through, a helicopter. Anyone in the helicopter won't feel anything because it's a Faraday cage.
Got it. So cool. So how do the utility companies respond to this? Because, utility companies, they don't make a lot of money with the delivery of the electricity. They make their, oftentimes, at least here in the US, it's the assets that they have that are part of their, what gives them a nice looking balance sheet. Okay, because the amount of money that they charge their customers oftentimes just about equals what it would have cost them to generate and transmit the electrical energy. So does this offer a level of economic benefit to the utilities, as well as providing levels of what's the word I'm looking for? Flexibility and reliability.
Yeah. So the answer is yes on all of those questions.
Oh, good.
So the economic, so the technology is it's early days of long-range wireless. It's, I guess, at the stage where you might have seen solar panels, say 4 decades or 5 decades ago. So quite early. However, unlike with solar panels, our technology is already economically viable, and the low-hanging fruit, so to speak, is line companies or utilities. they have some issues that can be can be solved relatively easy by going wireless. Now, because it's early days, it's quite hard to reach, or it'll take some time before we reach levels of efficiency that would justify using wireless on a larger scale, so a transmission scale. At the moment, it's the distribution mostly where you can see economic benefit. Edge of grid, remote communities, when you need to traverse forests and you don't want to cut down the vegetation, when you need to power islands and you don't want to go through bother with underwater cables, and goes with offshore wind farms. So the economic benefit is really in particular cases at the moment. Most of the benefit that we're hearing from our clientele is, well, first it has to do with the support of the uptake of sustainable energy. It's the cost of underwater cables, the cost of connecting solar farms to grids, the bureaucratic barriers, rites of passage, all these barriers suddenly become, well, a non-issue if you go wireless. So there are quite a few other drivers beyond the economic driver. Reducing outages, for example, and you've mentioned fires. So undergrounding cables may cost millions of dollars per mile. Going wireless costs a fraction of that. So I guess the benefit is quite substantial on many fronts.
So it sounds like, from an infrastructure perspective, for a country, an area to be able to put a transmission of electrical energy structure in place, this is one of those kinds of technologies that it's almost it's a leapfrog sort of a thing. I mean, one of the things that I realized, when you talk about cellular technology, cell phones, the proliferation of cell phones in the third world, quote unquote, for people who are now able to do things, connect to the internet with their smartphones in places that they don't even really have electricity just yet. I mean, it's just amazing. Okay. And it sounds like this has a similar kind of a thing. I'm putting this on par to what I've just recently been reading about, that that Starlink is intending to do for internet connectivity for remote locations, right? That don't have the full infrastructure like we do for for cable and whatnot, like we have in major metropolitan areas. And so is this activity, the technology you're looking at, is this how do I want to say this? When you look at a major metropolitan area, for instance, is it a practical implementation in a major metropolitan area, or is it more for the point to point of where the power plant is generating the initial energy, right, and then getting it to a local location that can then put it through the wires? I mean, what do you see for how that's supposed to work?
So there are quite a few use cases, and some of them are in densely populated areas, some of them are rural. And it really depends on the country and the electricity grid and the specific issues. So for example, in India, we see a lot of issues with electrocution in densely populated areas where it's very, very dense, not well regulated, and going wireless sort of resolves that issue. In other places, you can see rural communities which would benefit from it. So the use cases are, we can think of initial use cases, but just like when, communication went wireless, you could see the immediate benefit. You can see the first sort of use cases, but what gets us going, what really excites us, is the understanding that this is an enabling technology. And once it's out there in the wild, it's going to probably be used in many ways we haven't even imagined.
Right.
And that's quite exciting. We can imagine what it could do for electric aviation or electric shipping, decarbonizing of various ventures, but who knows? Who knows? Every week people write to us and tell us about some new interesting ideas they have, like just got an email talking about offshore fish farms and
Oh,
their
wow.
challenges. Um,
I mean,
yeah, powering, yeah.
when you just sit back and you start to think about how things could operate in that capacity, where an electric motor is able to be utilized to power whatever it happens to be, whether it's the lights on the sailboat that's out, you're sailing across the Pacific Ocean, whatever, or your laptop at your on the retreat that you're going into when you're on some, up in the mountains somewhere. The concepts are really interesting, and it really does open up the possibilities of utilization in so many different areas. From the standpoint of the consumer, who may ultimately be looking to employ a technology like this, would it mean that the consumer would need a receiving antenna in their location, and then have that then be connected to as the power source for their lights, their radio, their TV, and stuff like that? Or is it really going to be down to the point of the substation for the power company, and then it goes out from the power company? I still haven't quite figured that part out in my head.
So you can think of it as virtual piping. So initially, it makes sense that it will be used by the utilities, right? The infrastructure companies, be it electricity or even telcos to power cell towers, right? Pumping stations or whatever. So it does make sense that we'll first see the technology rolled out commercially, used by infrastructure companies, right? The utilities. However, I think it's inevitable that this sort of technology will end up in the hands of us, people, and we're going to find a myriad of use cases to use it, either in my cabin or look. We're going through an amazing phase of electrification of anything from cars to ships and aviation, and
That's true. Yeah.
So having a technology, moving from a wired to a wireless technology, is kind of essential to enable that happen, right?
Yeah.
The infrastructure is lagging behind. I mean, we are looking at a mobile, a decentralized world, and trying to power it with wires like we used to 150 years ago. So there has to be a change. I guess it will start with companies and gradually work itself into everyone's homes.
And you guys are at the forefront of that change. So how did you get involved in this yourself? Has this been an area of interest for you for a long time? I mean, what brought you to this kind of endeavor?
So I was fortunate enough to have a couple of reasonable exits in the past. So it allowed me to sit down and think about what's important in life. And I guess my answers aren't very different to some other entrepreneurs. I look to give back to society. I've enjoyed the benefits of being born and living in a free, democratic, capitalist society. So I am a strong believer in succeed and help others succeed. So when I looked at what I can contribute, I ended up looking at high impact technologies, the sort of technologies that the commercialization of could impact positively, impact well on the most number of people. And if you boil down what's out there in terms of tech, it really comes down to information and energy. Everything else is proxies and derivatives. I've had some ideas about what can be done in terms of information, and that's a conversation for another interview, I guess. When I looked at energy, I've looked at it systematically and then realized that, well, there's only three real parts to the commercial side of energy. There's generation, transmission, and storage. Now,
Mm-hmm.
there's quite a lot of good work that has been done on generation, right? Especially sustainable generation of energy. I didn't find that I could contribute much to it, given the mature stage of the tech out there. When I looked at storage, again, more recently, but over the last sort of decade or two, mainly driven by electric vehicles, a lot of progress has been done with batteries. We're now looking at solid state and various other means. And again, couldn't see anything significant I could do in that field. But when I looked at the transmission, it seemed to have stagnated and at least physically remained pretty much the same. Obviously, there has been some change, but almost no change since 130, 120 years ago. And that's quite staggering if you think of the progress that some other fields have seen. In aviation, we went from the Wright brothers to Mars. Have changed from steam to internal combustion to rockets to nuclear. Quite a significant change, while we're still powering everything with the same copper wires. So it dawnted on me, well, hey, let's have a thought experiment. What value can be unlocked if we go wireless? And it just kept coming, with more and more and more value that can be created for countries, communities, whole sectors. So that really got me going. I understood that if we can crack that, we'll uncover a lot of value. So this is what got me going. In fact, it was a single article I read about a community in Tonga, a Pacific island, where they literally burn through 20% of their GDP on diesel, because that's how they generate energy for the whole island. And that I found it just ridiculous that at this day and age, an island community that stands to be most affected from global warming still has to burn so much of its economic power on burning diesel. And that's only to, and most of the communities still stay without electricity because the cost of the infrastructure is just cost prohibitive. So, no light at school, no light at, for the kids after school. That means that they can't play soccer, they can't be, anyway, that's really what drove me to start it.
Well, that's actually very cool to hear, Greg. I mean, it's like the socially conscious entrepreneur is a wonderful thing, and it speaks directly to me, and so that's wonderful. I really appreciate it. We're actually at a point where we've got like a minute left in our opportunity to have this conversation, and we've pretty much gotten through the kinds of things that I wanted to. What is the next step for you? What can you tell us before we quickly wrap up? What is the next step for Emrod?
So the next step for Emrod is really proving that the technology is not science fiction, that it works out there in the wild. So we're looking at deploying it in the field, here in New Zealand first, but also having some conversations with companies overseas. So really deploying it out in the wild, showing everybody that it's workable, and then working with different use cases, different industries to start implementing technology.
Well, very cool. Well, what we should do then is another 6 to 9 months to reconnect and maybe have another conversation and see how the technology is being implemented and spreading. So, Greg, thank you for being here today. So, ladies and gentlemen, I want to just let you know if you have any questions about anything we talked about, you can send us a query at info@referencepointtv.com. You've seen here Greg's website on the screen here as we've gone through and stuff like that. So feel free to reach out and learn things, because this is a phenomenal technology. Greg, thank you once again for being willing to join us here on Reference Point. Wonderful to meet you. Look forward to great things from your company. And ladies and gentlemen, we'll see you next time on Reference Point.
Thank you, Dave.